Under bright morning lights in Gyeongju, South Korea, cameras followed Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney as he stepped toward the press platform, calm, composed, and deliberate. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit had just concluded, leaving behind a trail of high-level meetings and cautious optimism. For Carney, the moment marked a turning point. After years of diplomatic chill, Canada and China had found what he described as constructive ground. He began with an announcement that signaled both intent and strategy. "I have accepted President Xi's invitation to visit China in the new year," Carney said. His tone was measured, but his words carried weight. For Canada, this was more than a courtesy visit. It was a signal that Ottawa was re-engaging with Beijing after years of strained relations that had left the two nations nearly frozen in dialogue. The backdrop of this meeting could not have been more symbolic. The Gyeongju Summit, attended by leaders from across the Pacific, was designed to revive regional trade ties after years of geopolitical uncertainty. Yet for Canada, the subtext was unmistakable: rebuilding trust with China, a country Carney described as increasingly influential and determining to the global system. Carney's message to the gathered reporters was simple: engagement is not endorsement, but necessity. "It doesn't do any good to talk to ourselves about these issues alone," he said. "It's important that we engage with the world's largest country by population, the second largest economy by value, and an increasingly determining factor in the global system." The phrasing was deliberate, a reminder that even as Ottawa maintains its Western alliances, the gravitational pull of China remains impossible to ignore. Under Carney's leadership, Canada appears to be attempting a diplomatic recalibration, one that blends principle with pragmatism, acknowledging that constructive dialogue may open paths that isolation cannot. Images from the press room showed Carney leaning slightly forward as he spoke, not defensive, but analytical. Behind him, the red and white of the Canadian flag flickered beneath camera flashes. To his right, aides shuffled briefing papers. To his left, reporters waited to decode what the Prime Minister's new tone might mean for Canada's foreign policy trajectory. For much of the past decade, relations between Ottawa and Beijing had been among the coldest in the Western world, marked by the detention of 2 Canadians in China, mutual accusations of interference, and years of diplomatic silence. Carney's remarks in Gyeongju did not erase that history, but they hinted at a shift in temperature. By announcing a forthcoming visit to China early next year, Carney was signalling a willingness to restart dialogue, not as a concession, but as strategy. Canadian officials have confirmed that preparatory work will involve ministers and senior diplomats focusing on specific areas of cooperation: climate transition, supply chain security, and technological standards. For Beijing, this meeting provided a symbolic validation. Canada, once among the most vocal critics within the G7, was returning to the table. For Ottawa, it was a test of whether engagement could serve national interest without diluting principle. At one point in the press conference, Carney appeared to address the political turbulence that has often surrounded Western dealings with China, including the constant barrage of commentary from social media and partisan critics. "We can spend our time watching Truth Social and worrying about individual reactions," he said, subtly referencing US political discourse. "We remain calm. We focus on what we can control, how we build at home, and our negotiations with the United States when they take place or resume in the best interests of Canada." The quote, unusually candid for a sitting Prime Minister, drew quiet smiles from some in the audience. It was a moment of clarity, a leader aware of the noise but determined not to be drowned out by it. Carney continued, outlining a pragmatic approach to trade. "The United States will only agree, as is the case in any trade negotiation, to something that is also in their interest. There are a number of points where those interests coincide, and we will wait until they are ready. That patience, the willingness to hold position rather than escalate rhetoric, reflected Carney's background as a former central banker: steady, cautious, methodical." Beyond the headlines, Carney's message carried implications for Canada's entire Asia-Pacific strategy. Analysts note that his upcoming visit to China will likely form part of a broader push to diversify Canada's trade relationships, reducing reliance on the United States while still maintaining strong North American ties. At a time when Washington and Beijing remain at odds over tariffs, technology, and global influence, middle powers like Canada are navigating a tightrope. Gyeongju offered a glimpse of how Carney plans to walk it. not by choosing sides, but by choosing engagement. For South Korea, which hosted the summit, the symbolism was powerful. A gathering meant to showcase dialogue amid division had produced one of its clearest examples of reconnection. Footage from the venue showed Carney leaving the press room with a small delegation. As he walked past rows of flags, South Korea's Taegukgi, the maple leaf and the Chinese red star, the optics told their own story, a new phase of cautious diplomacy. Carney's demeanour during the summit stood out for its composure. Even as questions turned toward controversial issues, from trade disputes to domestic criticism, he returned repeatedly to one theme: calm leadership. Observers noted that his remarks avoided confrontation, focusing instead on shared challenges: global stability, economic cooperation, and the environment. In a political landscape often defined by sharp rhetoric, Carney's emphasis on measured dialogue may reflect a strategic bet that credibility comes not from volume, but from steadiness. In his words, we are focusing on what we can control, building at home, preparing our next steps abroad, and ensuring that our diplomacy serves Canadian interests. That sentiment, echoed through multiple answers, encapsulated his governing style: deliberate, data-driven, and grounded in institutional discipline rather than populist swings. Toward the end of the press conference, the tone briefly shifted from diplomacy to sports, a rare, humanizing moment. Asked about the Canadian baseball team's first World Series win since 1993, Carney smiled. "They take risks, they're aggressive, and they're a team," he said with visible pride. "You don't need to be a big American team to win the World Series. If you take risks, you play as a team, that gets you to the top, and our Canada takes risks and we're a team." The crowd laughed softly. It was a light moment, but one that echoed his earlier remarks: teamwork, composure, and risk-taking, values that mirrored his diplomatic message. In that instant, Carney connected two narratives, and one of sport, one of statecraft, both built on perseverance and calculated boldness. For a country redefining its global posture, the metaphor was apt. As the summit wound down, the larger picture came into focus. Carney's meeting with Xi was not a breakthrough in policy terms, but it represented a psychological shift. After years of suspicion and distance, the willingness to engage, even cautiously, marked progress. In the months leading up to his visit to China, officials are expected to outline a framework of economic and environmental cooperation, focusing on carbon neutrality targets, mineral supply chains, and digital governance standards. At the same time, Ottawa is unlikely to drop its concerns about human rights or foreign interference, issues that have long complicated the relationship. The tone, however, suggests a preference for pragmatic diplomacy over public confrontation. As cameras followed leaders departing the APEC venue, the symbolism of the location was not lost on observers. Gyeongju, a city steeped in history and diplomacy, became the stage for a quieter, more deliberate kind of diplomacy. Carney's approach, calm, cooperative, calculated, contrasts sharply with the turbulent years that preceded it. Whether it will translate into tangible progress remains to be seen, but the signal is clear. Canada is stepping back into dialogue with the world's major powers on its own terms. For South Korea, hosting such recalibrations reinforced its growing role as a bridge between East and West. For Carney, it may mark the first chapter in a new era of Canadian foreign policy, one built not on slogans, but on steady strategic engagement. From the marble halls of Gyeongju to the corridors of Ottawa, the echoes of this summit will linger. Mark Carney's constructive discussion with Xi Jinping is more than a diplomatic headline. It's a message about posture and purpose. Canada, after years of hesitation, is re-entering the global conversation, not as a spectator, but as a participant determined to shape outcomes through engagement, steadiness, and strategy. As Carney prepares for his journey to China early next year, one question will define the narrative. Can Canada rebuild trust with the world's second-largest economy without compromising its core values? The answer will shape not just bilateral ties, but the future of Canada's place in a shifting global order.